When people think about Puerto Rican migration, they usually picture New York, Spanish Harlem, the South Bronx, maybe Chicago. But what if I told you that decades before Puerto Ricans began a familiar sight in New York City? Thousands of them had already crossed oceans, worked on sugar plantations in Hawaii, picked cotton in Arizona, built new lives in Cuba, settled in St. Croix, worked in the Dominican Republic, and even traveled to places like Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil. Today, almost nobody talks about those journeys. Yet, in 1947, researchers at the University of Puerto Rico did. They produced an extraordinary study documenting where Puerto Ricans had gone, why they left, what kind of people they were, what worked they did, and whether they ever came back. Today, we're going to follow those forgotten journeys, not through myths, not through family stories, but through one remarkable historical document that captured Puerto Rican migration before it became the story most of us think we know. Hello everybody, my name is Josué and welcome to another Chronicles and Cocktails, where history is always on the menu. If you're new here, every week we explore the people, places, food, drinks, and the stories that have shaped Puerto Rico and the Hispanic world. And if you enjoy history that's based on real research, not internet myths, consider subscribing and joining us every Sunday. Now, when we hear the words Puerto Rican migration, most of us immediately think about New York. And that's understandable. The migration to New York changed Puerto Rican history forever. But here's something that surprised me. Several years before that migration reached its peak, a researcher named Clarence Senior, working for the Social Science Research Center at the Universidad de Puerto Rico, published a study simply titled Puerto Rican Emigration. This wasn't written as a history book. It wasn't written to entertain. It was written to answer a practical question. Where were Puerto Ricans going and why? In trying to answer that question, Senior unintentionally preserved something priceless. A snapshot of Puerto Rican migration during the first half of the 20th century. Through government records, employment contracts, official statistics, and hundreds of questionnaires completed by Puerto Rican migrants themselves, he reconstructed a forgotten chapter of our history. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Not every Puerto Rican who left, not every destination, but the migration story that this remarkable 1947 study tells. So, get your rum ready, because today we're going on a journey. To understand where Puerto Ricans were going, we first have to understand why they were leaving. One of the first things Clarence Senior makes clear is that Puerto Ricans were not simply wandering the world looking for adventure. They were responding to economic realities. According to the study, Puerto Rico in the first half of the 20th century faced increasing pressure from rapidly growing population, limited land, and insufficient employment opportunities. These conditions led many policymakers and scholars to ask whether immigration could provide at least part of the answer. But Senior also challenges an idea that many people held at the time. There was a common belief that Puerto Ricans simply would not leave their island, that they were too attached to their homeland, too attached to their families, too attached to their culture. The evidence, he argued, showed otherwise. Puerto Ricans, like people everywhere else, would live in search of a better life, a better job, a better future for their children, or simply opportunities that did not exist at home. And once transportation improved, migration accelerated. In fact, one statistic in the book is astonishing. The author calculated that nearly half of all recorded net migration during the 38 years between 1908 and 1946 occurred during just the first 5-year period from 1941 to 1946. Something had clearly changed. But before that great wartime movement, Puerto Ricans had already been living for decades. The question is, where? If you had asked a Puerto Rican in 1910 where people from the island were moving, the answer probably would not have been New York. In fact, our first stop today is nearly 5,000 miles away. Hawaii. Hawaii. It may seem like an unlikely place to begin the story of Puerto Rican migration. After all, today, Hawaii and Puerto Rico sit nearly 5,000 miles apart. Different oceans, different cultures, different histories. But according to Clarence Senior's study, Hawaii became the oldest large Puerto Rican community established outside the island during the 20th century. By the time he wrote his report in 1947, he estimated that approximately 9,300 Puerto Ricans were living there, most of them descendants of the laborers who had arrived during the first decade of the century. Think about that journey for a moment. No airplanes, no direct flights, no social media. For many of those men and women, leaving Puerto Rico meant saying goodbye to everything they had ever known. Many would never see the island again. Why Hawaii? The answer wasn't tourism. It wasn't paradise. It was sugar. According to the study, Hawaiian plantation owners faced a constant demand for dependable labor. As native Hawaiians increasingly resisted plantation work, employers recruited workers from abroad. Chinese workers came first, then Japanese, later Filipinos, and then Portuguese, Koreans, Spaniards, and eventually Puerto Ricans. The time couldn't have been more significant. Both Puerto Rico and Hawaii came under United States sovereignty in 1898. Shortly afterward, recruiters began looking toward Puerto Rico as another source of labor. Imagine living in rural Puerto Rico around 1900. You've probably never left your municipality. Maybe you've never even seen San Juan. Then someone arrives offering steady work on an island you've probably never heard of, across the largest ocean on Earth. Would you go? For thousands of Puerto Ricans, the answer was yes. The work waiting for them was difficult. Most Puerto Rican migrants became plantation laborers. The study cites census data showing that in 1930, more than half of employed Puerto Ricans in Hawaii worked as unskilled plantation laborers, while nearly 40% worked in semi-skilled plantation jobs. Very few entered the professions or owned businesses. The report paints a sobering picture. Few Puerto Ricans became physicians. Few became lawyers. Few became teachers. Few owned farms. Instead, most remained tied to plantation life. But the author doesn't stop there. He asks a more difficult question. How successful was the Puerto Rican community in Hawaii? His answer is complicated. Using studies available at the time, Senior concludes that Puerto Ricans generally had greater difficulty achieving economic success than several other immigrant groups already living in Hawaii. He points to high rates of poverty, limited movement into skilled occupations, and comparatively low rates of land ownership. It's important to remember that these conclusions reflect the research and language available in the 1940s. Throughout the book, Senior is evaluating migration as a social scientist writing in his own era, using methods and assumptions common at the time. One of the things I appreciate about this book is that it doesn't try to romanticize migration. Today, it's easy to look back and imagine that anyone who left Puerto Rico automatically found a better life. But Senior wasn't interested in myths. He wanted evidence. Sometimes that evidence showed success. Sometimes it didn't. Yet the story wasn't entirely negative. The report also documents remarkable improvements in some areas. Infant mortality among Puerto Rican families in Hawaii became dramatically lower than it was back in Puerto Rico. Overall, death rates declined. Health outcomes improved over time. In other words, life wasn't simply better or worse. It was different. Economically, many families struggled, but medically, some conditions improved considerably. Like many migration stories, the reality was more complicated than either success or failure. By 1947, Hawaii represented one chapter in Puerto Rico's migration story, but it was far from the only one. While some Puerto Ricans crossed the Pacific, others stayed much closer to home. Only a few hundred miles, another island was becoming an important destination, one that many Puerto Ricans today have almost forgotten: St. Croix. After traveling nearly 5,000 miles across the Pacific, our next destination is much closer to home. Only about 40 miles southeast of Puerto Rico lies the island of St. Croix. Today, it's part of the United States Virgin Islands as a territory of the United States. But during the period covered by Clarence Senior's study, St. Croix represented something very different. It was nearby. It was familiar. And for many Puerto Ricans, it offers something they desperately needed: work. Senior tells us that by the mid-1940s, St. Croix had become one of the largest Puerto Rican communities outside the island. In fact, after Hawaii, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, he identifies St. Croix as one of the principal destinations of Puerto Rican immigrants, estimating that approximately 3,000 Puerto Ricans lived there. That number may surprise many Puerto Ricans today. St. Croix is rarely mentioned when we discuss our migration history, yet for decades it was an important destination. And honestly, this one makes perfect sense. Think about it. If you were a Puerto Rican laborer in the early 1900s, which option sounds less intimidating? A weeks-long voyage across the Pacific to Hawaii? Or a relatively short trip to another Caribbean island where the climate looked familiar, the crops looked familiar, and you could probably return home if things didn't work out, right? For many people, St. Croix was much less of a leap into the unknown. Unlike Hawaii, however, Senior doesn't devote an entire chapter to St. Croix. Instead, he uses the island as something of a case study, not to describe plantation life in detail, but to evaluate whether migration actually worked. Could Puerto Ricans build successful lives somewhere else? Or would they simply encounter the same hardship they had left behind? Senior reaches an interesting conclusion. He argues that the experience in St. Croix suggested that Puerto Ricans who possessed initiative, who were willing to work, and who adapted to local conditions often fared better than they had in Puerto Rico. Those who could not compete frequently returned home. From this, the author concludes that successful migration tended to become a kind of natural selection. Those who adapted remained, those who did not came back. Now, this is an important point. Notice what Senior is doing. He's not saying that every Puerto Rican succeeded, nor is he saying that every Puerto Rican failed. Instead, he's asking a question that runs through the entire book. What made one migrant successful, while another returned home? That question becomes one of the major themes of this study. And as we continue our journey, you're going to notice the same pattern appearing again and again and again. For Senior, migration wasn't random. He believed that education, training, work experience, adaptability, and opportunity all influence whether a migrant built a new life or packed their bags and returned to Puerto Rico. That idea appears repeatedly throughout the book, regardless of the destination. But St. Croix wasn't the only nearby island attracting Puerto Rican workers. Only a little farther west, another Caribbean nation needed labor, and thousands of Puerto Ricans answered the call. If Hawaii represented the longest journey and St. Croix the nearest, then Cuba represented something else entirely. Opportunity. Not because life there was necessarily easier, but because Cuba's sugar industry was booming. According to Senior, labor recruiters organized the movement of Puerto Rican workers to Cuban sugar centrales before the Second World War. One recruitment effort alone sent 671 Puerto Ricans to work for the Central Preston sugar mill in 1919, while another Cuban sugar operation recruited additional workers that same year. For Puerto Rican workers already familiar with cutting sugar cane or working in agricultural communities, Cuba represented a logical destination. The work was familiar, the climate was familiar, and Spanish was spoken. And unlike Hawaii, home wasn't impossibly far away. One thing that's becoming very clear is that Puerto Rican migration wasn't following a single path. It was responding to opportunity. Sugar was expanding. Puerto Ricans went where sugar needed workers. Factories needed labor. Puerto Ricans went there. Railroads hired. Puerto Ricans boarded trains. This wasn't one migration. It was dozens of migrations, each driven by different economic opportunities. And our next destination was another neighbor, la República Dominicana.
Voy a cantar esta canción con mucho cariño de mi corazón. corazón a la República Dominicana, la casa del merengue y la casa de la bachata. Voy a cantar esta canción con mucho cariño.
Notice something. Not everyone living in Puerto Rico was an agricultural laborer. Not everyone was cutting sugarcane. Sometimes, companies were looking for mechanics, people with technical skills, workers who already knew how to repair equipment. That's also something very important. Puerto Rican migration wasn't made up just of one type of person. It included farm workers, factory workers, mechanics, seamstresses, and skilled laborers. The destinations changed because the jobs changed. Senior repeatedly distinguishes between skilled and unskilled workers. Sometimes employers wanted large numbers of agricultural laborers. Other times, they recruited only a handful of people with specific experience. That distinction becomes even more important later, during World War II, when American industries began actively selecting Puerto Rican workers with vocational training. But in the 1920s, those specialized recruitments were already happening. The Dominican Republic was close. The language was familiar. The climate was familiar. And the sugar economy looked much like Puerto Rico's. For some Puerto Ricans, it represented a chance to use the skill already possessed without traveling halfway around the world. But not every destination involved sugar. In one case, Puerto Ricans left Caribbean altogether, heading toward the mountains of South America. Their destination? Colombia. Sugar wasn't the only crop creating demand for labor. Coffee was as well. According to Clarence Senior, 2 organized groups of Puerto Rican workers traveled to Colombia in 1925 to work on the Santa Marta coffee plantation. Unfortunately, the historical record is incomplete. Senior tells us that the number of workers in the first group is unknown. The second group consisted of 87 people. That's one of the fascinating aspects of this book. Sometimes the historical record is incredibly detailed. Other times, it's frustratingly incomplete. Senior doesn't try to invent missing information. If the records don't exist, he simply tells us they don't exist. You know, as historians, that's exactly what we should do. One thing I really appreciate about this study is its honesty. There are moments where Senior could have guessed. He could have estimated. Instead, he simply says, you know what? I don't know. We don't have the facts. And sometimes that's the most accurate answer history can give us. By the mid-1920s, Puerto Rican workers could have already been found in plantations, factories, and industries spread across the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and the Pacific. But then, something interesting happened. The destinations became even more diverse. Not hundreds of workers, just a handful: mechanics, seamstresses, factory employees, small recruitments for every specific job. Not every migration described by Clarence Senior involved thousands of people. Some involved only dozens, or even fewer. Yet, together they paint an extraordinary picture of Puerto Rican mobility during the first half of the 20th century. According to the study, 17 Puerto Ricans traveled to Venezuela in 1927. The group consisted of mechanics and seamstresses, recruited to work in a clothing factory. Again, the destination reflected the job. This wasn't agricultural labor, this wasn't sugar, it was manufacturing, Puerto Rican workers were increasingly being recruited because employers believed they possessed useful skills. Elsewhere in the book, Senior also identifies Puerto Rican communities living in Mexico, Brazil, San Tomas, and other locations throughout the Caribbean and the rest of the Americas. Some communities were large, others were small. Some developed through organized recruitment. Others grew as migrants followed relatives and friends or simply opportunity. By now, a pattern should be emerging. Puerto Rican migration wasn't random. It followed jobs, sugar, coffee factories, mechanics, manufacturing. Wherever employers needed workers, Puerto Ricans appeared. And for nearly every destination we've discussed today, the story begins exactly the same way. Some people needed labor, and someone in Puerto Rico was willing to answer the call. But none of these migrants would compare to what happened during the Second World War, because for the first time, the United States government itself became deeply involved in recruiting Puerto Rican workers, and that would transform Puerto Rican migration forever. Everything we've talked about so far, Hawaii, Cuba, St. Croix, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic, those migrations were important, but they were relatively small. Then the world went to war, and suddenly Puerto Rican workers were needed on a scale never seen before. By 1942, the United States was fully engaged in World War II. Millions of American men entered military service. Factories expanded around the clock. Railroads operated day and night. Shipyards, mines, and defense plants desperately needed workers. There simply weren't enough people to fill every job. According to Clarence Senior, officials in Puerto Rico began discussing whether Puerto Rican workers could help meet those wartime labor shortages. Representatives from numerous federal agencies, including the Departments of War, Navy, Labor and Interior, the War Manpower Commission, and major labor organizations explored the possibility. Unlike many early migrations, this one was carefully organized, at least at first. The War Department agreed to transport between 800 and 1,500 workers every month. But not everyone qualified. Applicants were interviewed and they had to demonstrate work experience. Vocational training was preferred. The interviews were conducted in English because officials wanted to know whether applicants could adapt to life and work on the mainland. Perhaps most surprisingly, workers also had to possess between $75 and $100 before leaving Puerto Rico. In total, approximately 1,030 men participated in this carefully selected program. That requirement really caught my attention. Imagine being unemployed during wartime, and before you could leave, you had to prove you already had money. Why? Well, because the planners believed successful migrants needed a financial cushion. Today we might call it starting capital. They weren't just sending workers. They were trying to send workers who, in their opinion, had the greatest chance of succeeding. After hundreds of pages, thousands of statistics, government reports, employment records, and the personal testimonies of Puerto Rican migrants, Clarence Senior finally arrives at the question that inspired this entire study. Could emigration actually solve Puerto Rico's problem? His answer was no, at least not by itself. Senior believed that emigration could certainly improve the lives of many individual Puerto Ricans. It could provide jobs, better wages, training, experience, new opportunities. It could even reduce some of the immediate pressure caused by unemployment. But he argued it could never become Puerto Rico's only solution. In one of the most memorable passages of the book, he compares relying exclusively on immigration to trying to empty a bathtub while leaving the faucet running. As long as the underlying causes continued, simply sending people elsewhere would never fully solve the problem. That's actually a remarkably balanced conclusion. Senior wasn't against migration, and he wasn't arguing that everyone should leave. He was saying something much simpler. Migration can help people, but migration alone cannot solve structural problems. The study also researches another conclusion that appears repeatedly throughout its pages. Successful migration rarely happened by accident. According to Senior, people were more likely to succeed when they possessed useful skills, accurate information, employment opportunities waiting for them, and the ability to adapt to new environments. When recruitment was carefully organized, the results generally improved. When promises exceeded reality or preparation disappeared, problems multiplied. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson this book leaves us. Puerto Rican migration wasn't one story. It wasn't a destination. It wasn't one generation. It was thousands of individual decisions. Some people crossed the Pacific to Hawaii. Others remained in the Caribbean. Some followed sugar. Others followed coffee. Factories, railroads, mechanic shops, manufacturing plants. Some found opportunity. Some found disappointment. Some returned home. Others never did. What this remarkable study reminds us is that behind every migration statistic, there was a family, a husband, a wife, a child, a young mechanic, a seamstress, a farm laborer. Someone who stood on a dock, looked back toward Puerto Rico, and wondered if they would ever see home again. Today's cocktail is a cocktail that we've already made here before. Today's recipe is based on La Floridita recipe book, and this is a very old, it's a reprint, but it's a very old book, published around the 1920s and 30s during the Prohibition era in the United States, and that Prohibition era included Puerto Rico. So you can get it at Amazon, which that's how I got it. And we are going to do recipe. I'll tell you right now. Daiquiri number 1 on page 17. Page 17 if you have it. And we're going to use 2 ounces of rum. We are going to use a teaspoon of sugar and the juice of half of a lemon. In the Caribbean, you call this lemons, green lemons. I know in the States, you usually call them lime, but we call them all lemons. This one in particular is the one that we need for this recipe. So we have the rum. The recipe calls for Bacardi. This is La Florida bar restaurant, and it was on the corner of Obispo Monserrate streets in La Habana. So of course they were going to use Bacardi because, as you know, Bacardi is Cuban, and then it moved to Puerto Rico. But in this case, since we're in Puerto Rico, we are going to use Puerto Rican rum. And I especially chose the daiquiri because we're talking about Cuba, we're talking about the Caribbean, we're talking about movement. And this is one of the cocktails that people were drinking in that period of time that we're talking about in this episode. So I have my personal shaker right here, and it's full of ice. So this is what we're gonna do. And we have the lime or the lemon, which we're gonna roll like this. That's just to get the juices out. We need a cocktail glass, ice, a lime lemon squeezer, the rum, and a little bit of sugar, whether it be simple syrup, white sugar, brown sugar, whichever you like. The recipe calls for half a lemon, you can use more if you like. I'm gonna use a little bit more. The simple syrup, homemade simple syrup, of course, and take a tablespoon, pour it into the lemon. Then, and we're gonna use around an ounce, in this case 1 ounce, but you can use 2 ounces. But then again, I'm doing the show, so I don't want to use a lot. Now that we have all the ingredients there, we're just gonna cover like so and just shake. And then the reason why this came to half, it's because I used only 1 ounce of rum, and you can garnish it with the lime or a lemon wedge or a dried lemon or a fresh lemon wheel, whichever you like, or just a piece of lemon in there. So there you go. How about that? Let's taste it. The aromas of the fresh lemon or lime. And it's so refreshing. Very refreshing. One of the reasons I wanted to dedicate an entire episode to this book is because I think we've forgotten how broad Puerto Rican history really is. And sometimes this isn't even taught in schools. You know that. Today, our migration story is often reduced to one destination, New York. And while New York absolutely deserves its place in our history, this book reminds us that long before that Great Migration reached its peak, Puerto Ricans had already scattered across the Caribbean, across the Pacific, across Latin America, and across the continental United States. Some journeys succeed, others failed. But together, they tell us something extraordinary. Puerto Ricans have never been afraid to cross oceans in search of a better life. If you're interested in Puerto Rican history, I genuinely think this book deserves to be remembered. Not because every conclusion it reaches has stood the test of time. Remember, it was written in 1947. Like every historical work, it reflects the knowledge, the methods, and even some of the assumptions of its own era. But that's precisely what makes it valuable. It doesn't simply tell us where Puerto Ricans went. It also tells us how Puerto Rico understood itself at one of the most important turning points in its modern history. And for that reason alone, I think it's well worth reading it. I'll leave a link on the description below. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Chronicles and Cocktails. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the forgotten chapters of Puerto Rican history, I truly appreciate it if you subscribed, share the episode with someone who loves history, and leave me a comment. And I'd love to hear from you. Where did your family come from? Did they stay in Puerto Rico? Did they move to New York, to Chicago, to Hawaii, to St. Croix, or somewhere else entirely? Tell me your family's story. Leave it in the comments. I'd love to read it. As always, I'll see you next Sunday. Until then, be good, be nice, have fun, get smart, read a lot, travel, go to church, and salud.